Good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Lynn Reese-Hardy, and I am the Maryland Stockstead Director of the Spencer Museum of Art. And on behalf of the Spencer Museum of Art staff, the Chair of the History of Art Department, Dr. David Kataforis, and Professor and Director of Graduate Studies, Dr. Marnie Kessler, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this lecture by Dr. Karl Kusserow, speaking this evening as part of the Murphy Seminar on the topic, Shooting the Moon, Art and the Unearthly. But from the Earth tonight, the moon is waxing, and it is at 60% illumination. In Lawrence, Kansas, the sky is clear. It seemed appropriate before we begin tonight, as we join remotely from many places on Earth, to acknowledge Native artist expression with a brief excerpt from 2019 Poet Laureate Joy Harjo's poem, Remember. So just the beginning stanza. Remember. Remember the sky that you were born under. Know of the stars' stories. Remember the moon, who she is. Remember the sun's birth at dawn, that is the strongest point of time. Remember sundown and the giving away tonight. The rest of the poem is really quite beautiful, but I will leave it to you to read it, to summon your own voices and your own images. But tonight we're here for Murphy Lectures. Since 1979, the Spencer Museum of Art, the Crest Foundation, Department of Art History at the University of Kansas, and the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art have been proud to sponsor the Murphy Lecture Series. Named in honor of Dr. Franklin D. Murphy, former Chancellor of the University of Kansas, this ambitious lecture series brings distinguished art historians, artists, or critics to Lawrence and Kansas City to speak on topics in areas of their expertise, yet of broad public interest. Dr. Murphy was committed to fostering relations between the University of Kansas and the Nelson Atkins Museum. Thus, the shared participation in the program of teaching, lectures, and publications. Dr. Murphy served as chancellor from 1951 to 1960 at the University of Kansas. During that period, he was instrumental in developing the museum's collections and supported many art programs on campus and beyond. He became one of the vital links between the University of Kansas and the Nelson Atkins Museum, where he was once a trustee, creating a busy channel that is still maintained, this channel of cultural exchange between Lawrence and Kansas City. Dr. Murphy's foresight and his gifts continue to contribute to the creative and the intellectual life of both these institutions as we watch expertise, students, art, and most importantly, shared purpose flow between the two. Illuminating scholarship, art, and ideas in the visual arts, the Murphy Lecture is always an annual season, an annual reminder of Dr. Murphy's guidance and enlightened perspectives on art, and maybe most specifically and important at this moment, on collaborations between museums of the world and academies. I'm especially pleased to turn it over and introduce my colleague and friend, Professor Marnie Kessler, who, if you know her, know that it is her energetic presence, her scholarship, and her sense of humor that shine very brightly at KU. So, Dr. Marnie Kessler.
Thank you, Sarah Lynn. First of all, for that beautiful introduction to the Murphy Lecture and that beautiful background, and your kind words move me. So good evening, everybody. I'm Marnie Kessler. I teach 19th century European art in the art history department. And before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that the University of Kansas resides on the ancestral territory of the Kaw people, who were forced off their land by the United States in the 19th century and largely relocated to Oklahoma. This acknowledgement recognizes Native Americans as traditional guardians of the land and the enduring relationship between Native peoples and these traditional territories. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, Dr. Karl Kusserow, who is the John Wilmerding Curator of American Art at the Princeton University Art Museum. When I decided to teach a Murphy seminar called Visual Ecologies, I knew exactly who I would ask to join me as the visiting Murphy professor, my dear old friend, Karl Kusserow, who has been at the forefront of formulating an eco-critical art history. In the seminar this semester, we have read and looked deeply and widely, focusing on the expansive affective, cultural, and material dimensions of representations of the natural world. Even more, we have come to understand that our engagement with such depictions is sharpened and enriched by a keen understanding of the ways in which they inscribe and intersect with such critical issues as settler colonialism, resource extraction, the Anthropocene, the Plantationocene, cryospheres, and the human-nature nexus. The Murphy seminar typically concludes with the Murphy professor's second visit to Kansas at the end of the semester, when we have several more seminar meetings and when the Murphy professor delivers a final public lecture. It saddens me greatly that Karl couldn't travel to Lawrence this week because an especially large tree root got in his way, a fact that seems somehow particularly unjust given the topic of the seminar. Talk about the complexities of the human nature nexus. But he joined us virtually during 2 marathon meetings this week. This is us last night in the seminar room. And as you know, he will do the same this evening. Karl first came onto the eco-critical art history scene while co-organizing with Alan Braddock the 2018 groundbreaking exhibition, Nature's Nation, American Art and the Environment, the accompanying book for which won the Alfred J. Barr Award for Best Catalog in the History of Art, a prose award from the Association of American Publishers for professional and scholarly excellence, and the Award for Excellence from the Association of Art Museum Curators. Many of the essays in this volume, particularly those written by Cusserow, have already become classics in the growing field of eco-art history. Similarly, Picture Ecology, Art and Eco-Criticism in a Planetary Perspective, which was published in 2021, and for which Karl was editor and major contributor, has already become indispensable for any student or scholar interested in eco-critical approaches to global art. He has organized many exhibitions, among them Picturing Power, New York Chamber of Commerce Portrait Collection, and most recently, Alexis Rockman, Shipwrecks. And he is completing work on Object Lessons in American Art, a traveling exhibition and scholarly catalog. As with his curatorial work, Karl's many essays and articles address a wide range of topic. However, there is often a through line, which he traces with clarity, intelligence, and sensitivity. The critical importance of our understanding of the agency of the natural world, and perhaps above all, the necessity that we treat it ethically. During his visits with our seminar in person in October, on the left, and his visit this week virtually, Karl has been a sensitive, generous, and thoughtful interlocutor. He is engaged with the students who beautifully delivered their final presentations this week in ways both wise and supportive. We have all been beneficiaries, not just of his profound intellect, but also of his kindness and deep humanity. His own words, as he articulates them in his introductory essay for picture ecologies, which he aptly entitled Connected, elegantly epitomizes his commitment to a more just art history. He writes, "Our embattled ecological present demands new art histories, a connectedness through a self-reflective attention to indigenous epistemologies, interspecies friendships, the desires of non-human life forms, and other ways of being in alterity that have been marginalized by colonialism, capitalism, and the economies of natural resource extraction. By re-engaging entanglements with matter and life, eco-art history serves to productively disturb and overwrite the anthropocentric foundations of Enlightenment art history with its roots in European colonial expansion." He continues, "Far beyond the purview of environmentalism, eco-critical thinking is a mode of imagining our engagement with the entities alongside which humans have shared the planet, as well as an acknowledgement of both the depths of our responsibilities to and for them, and the fact of our human limitations." Karl's lecture this evening is titled "Shooting the Moon, Art and the Unearthly." Please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A function throughout the lecture. And please also join me in welcoming my friend, Karl Kusserow, to KU.
My goodness, Marnie, thank you so much. That was hands down the nicest introduction I've ever had. And Sarah Lynn, thank you so much for your equally lovely introduction. What a great way to start with poetry and praise. I feel very fortunate for both of those. So thank you. And I feel fortunate to have had that time with you all. And I'm very sorry that I'm not able to be there in person this time. As Marnie indicated, a tree root got in the way, and gravity, which of course on the moon would not have been a factor, was a factor here as I was trying to avoid the tree root unsuccessfully, and wound up with a couple of broken ribs, which are happily on the mend, but it did preclude me from hopping on a plane and getting out to see you. So I will try and make up for it somehow, and I will say that I really deeply enjoyed the time I spent with the students, not just in October, but more recently, as Marnie says, just a few days ago, and learned a lot from you all, and I'm grateful for that as well. So let me see if I can offer some things that you might learn from in return by first sharing my screen and saying that the title has shifted just a little bit in the intervening months and weeks between evolving the one originally. And that seemed, here's the old one. This is actually the last slide from the previous lecture at the Nelson Atkins. On the left, the image advertises this lecture with the title that you had. And we'll get to the reason for the shift in a minute. On the right, just a reminder of how the talks are structured, which is in chronological phases corresponding to the 8 phases of the moon, as shown here in Johannes von Loon's map from Harmonia Macrocosmica of 1660, in moving counterclockwise from new to full and back again. But the new title, I think, better reflects what has emerged as the overarching leitmotif of these talks, not so much that is representing or shooting the moon, as one might say with regard to photography, but rather the ways in which we do so reflects back on us as humans. And I think that is suggested here by two poems of the same title by Borges. And I'll just give you a couple of seconds to read them. They're both quite lovely and suggestive. So before proceeding with this evening's new material, which corresponds to the final 4 phases of the moon, let's refer back briefly to the 4 covered in the last lecture, identified there by the icons from Van Loon's map corresponding to the moon's first 4 phases. In the first station on our way around the map, we considered prehistoric reckonings with the moon in which the thing itself is not portrayed. Rather, it is the trace of its observation that is recorded through notches on animal bones, for example, as a means of marking time via its appearance and various phases, which provide the basis for early calendrical systems. So borrowing from semiotician Charles Peirce, representing the moon was initially and for thousands of years indexical versus symbolic or iconic as it was to become later. An index being a type of sign where the signifier is caused by the signified but does not look like it. For example, smoke is an index of fire. And we considered the implications of this in developing the human capacity for abstract conceptual thought, such that the invisible phase of the moon, the new moon, must be considered as part of its cycle, even when there is no evidence, no visual sign of its existence. More ecologically, we also considered how the same cyclical nature of the moon offered a master explicatory paradigm for human, animal, and vegetable life, one of transformation through successive birth, growth, decline, death, rebirth, and renewal, as such offering a means of understanding the cycle of life itself. In the second chronological phase, we looked at how diverse ancient cultures represented the moon in their mythologies, usually in a way at once deified with the special attributes and power of the divine, and personified with certain aspects of their appearance relating to that of human beings, in a process of sacralization that was hugely pervasive. And we considered solarization, the shift in orientation from lunar-centric to a solar-centric cosmology, owing to parallel shifts in the human orientation to and attitudes toward the non-human environment. Specifically, the steady ascendance of animal and agricultural husbandry and the sun's critical role in it, in promoting growth and determining seasons. We also thought about gender and the ways moon gods, initially largely male, became feminized in keeping with the parallel ascription of male attributes to the newly prominent sun gods. In the third phase, we saw the emergence of images of the moon as itself, though initially and through medieval times, schematically and primarily in its most recognizable mode as a crescent. That begins to change with Renaissance humanism, as Giotto and Van Eyck made initial veristic images of the moon. And it begins to change a lot in the lecture's final, fourth phase, when the promotion of the scientific method, empirical understanding of the world following a systematic methodology based on evidence, leads to tools like the telescope, through which the once familiar moon became strangely ever more unfamiliar, even as it was better understood. So picking up in a bit more detail with that final phase before launching into a new one, here is Galileo's famous initial sketches of the moon at left, which are quickly published in his treatise, The Starry Messenger, constituting a quantum leap in perceptions and understandings of the true nature of the moon's surface, appearance, and probable environmental characteristics, which, problematically, suggest a place that in fact appears rather unearthly, and thus a problem for the abiding anthropocentric project of viewing the moon as another Earth, in the hopeful phrase of the day. the very tools, science, invention in the form of the telescope, observation, representation of the human species that Christianity had ordained special and superior had rendered the opposite effect. As if in response, we get a series of serious, as here, and less so, as on the next slide, of attempts to make the moon, to make of the moon what anthropocentrism wanted. That is, in the words of John Wilkins' subtitle, another habitable planet. The image at left, for example, shows the literally humanized moon made to conform to each of the lunar phases, despite the need for all sorts of physiognomic contortions. And in a similar vein, Francis Godwin's The Man and the Moon describes just that, the voyage of a man, courtesy of the goose-powered contraption opposite the title page, to the moon, where he dwells amicably among its inhabitants before returning unharmed to the earth. Okay, so we're all caught up, and now in this new fifth phase, we'll see how, ironically, just as the moon comes most fully into view, as in the full moon pictured here, using the beliefs, strategies, techniques of evolving science, itself a wholly human-induced advance, it became ever less what those same techniques had hoped to show. That is, it became ever less the other Earth that our anthropocentric proclivities wished to make of it. We're going to look in particular at a dense and revealing 15-year period during the 17th century, when, following advances in telescopy, the moon was initially represented in increasing detail and mapped and named. The trajectory of this intense period underscores the overarching theme of these talks, the pervasively anthropocentric approach to comprehending and seeking to utilize the moon for human ends. So Claude Mellon was a pupil in Rome of Simon Vouet, an extraordinary engraver. His engravings of the moon were promoted by two French astronomers, one of them of means, who was able to support this endeavor. And it enabled him to produce these three drawings and engravings after them, which were never published following the 1637 death of one of the promoters. You'll note that these moons have no nomenclature, which is at issue because it left the project of knowing the moon sort of half done, with features described visually, but not colonized or brought into the realm of human understanding by naming them. A few years later, the Belgian cartographer, who was royal cosmographer and a mathematician to the King of Spain, Michael van Langren, produces a true map of the moon with stylized plottings on a flat plane, which you might compare to Galileo's and Mellon's shadings with their interest in and suggestion of depth, and thus also a greater suggestion of an Earth-like nature to the place. Van Langren, by contrast, believed he could improve the accuracy of the determination of longitude, which was of enormous importance to seafaring and thus imperial enterprise, by observing the moon's peaks and craters as they appear and disappear throughout lunation, or the lunar month. Hence, his map of the moon, originally intended at 30 different phases but never realized, he was the first to assign names to lunar features, but few endured because they mostly corresponded to Catholic figures. His work was supported by Spain, who was at the time seeking every possible advantage over its rival England. And thus the moon was first extensively mapped, in this case, not for itself, but to advance a colonial enterprise. Just 2 years later, astronomer and mayor of Danzig, Johannes Hevelius, produced more than a map. He produced a lunar atlas with engravings showing a complete lunar cycle at roughly 2-night intervals in images of exhaustive detail. Yet despite this plethora of information, it was not a meaningful advance over Van Langren, except insofar as it was better used in navigation because of the briefer periods in which different maps were made, which would allow for more precise seagoing navigation based on observation of the moon. So what we're seeing is that the piling on of information based on the newly codified scientific method, which was articulated just a few decades before by Francis Bacon and set forth his method of inductive reasoning based on observation, was not adding particular insight, nor was it making of the moon the other Earth that Galileo's images at least left open the possibility of it being. So ironically, the more humans learned about the moon and the more precisely they represented it in the attempt to humanize it, the less so it became. Finally, in 1651, with Riccioli, a Jesuit priest and intellectual, we have the culmination of this intense brief period in the publication of his new Almagest, which references Ptolemy's great 2nd century text and, in a sense, claims similar import in terms of scope and historical sweep. It engages not just the moon, but the heavens generally, and reviews past understandings of it. For our purposes, it is noteworthy in reflecting the era's contest between scientific and religious dogma, two increasingly opposed ways of knowing, where Riccioli was particularly conflicted. The frontispiece, which you see at left, shows mythological figures weighing the heliocentric theory of Copernicus in a balance against his modified version of Tycho Brahe's geo-heliocentric system, which contained elements of both the Earth-centered Ptolemaic system and the sun-centered Copernican system. In his theory, the other planets revolved around the sun, which itself revolved around the Earth. The old Ptolemaic geocentric theory lies discarded on the ground, made obsolete by the telescope's discoveries. So here, Riccioli is towing the religious parting line. Yet, although he had publicly needed to reject the Copernican theory, in the book's moon maps, he named a prominent crater Copernicus and other prominent craters after proponents of Copernicus's theory. Because the craters that he and Francesco Grimaldi, who drew the maps, named after themselves are in the same general vicinity as these, while craters named for some other Jesuit astronomers are in different parts of the moon, near the very prominent crater named for Tycho Brahe, Riccioli's lunar nomenclature seems a veiled expression of sympathy for a Copernican theory that, as a Jesuit, he could not publicly support. In any case, the maps themselves continue and extend Hevelius's overdetermined style, piling on so much information that the image verges on collapse, a far cry from Galileo's far simpler images at the beginning of the century, which still extended the hope of a place for Earth-like life on the moon. Indeed, in his map, Riccioli included a direct statement that the moon is not inhabited. And despite the visual cacophony, it was actually Riccioli's schema that had the longest legs of all the images and maps and makers we've reviewed. And the new names of the lunar features he provided form the basis for nomenclature still in use today. The conundrum of the ironically ever diverging paths of the will to make of the moon another Earth for anthropocentric ends, and the growing unlikelihood of it, based on its increasingly accurate representation through human-engendered advances in science and technology, continued through the 17th and into the 18th century, reaching a kind of culmination in this image. By this time, the moon had long been named and known in terms of its features. John Russell focuses on their hyper photorealistic representation in this, the largest image of the moon to date. Russell was the foremost English pastelist of the day and primarily a portraitist. He brought color and unprecedented detail to his images of the moon, which were produced over 30 years in 187 careful drawings and at least 7 full pastels, with the use of a 6-foot telescope designed by Royal astronomer William Herschel, and incorporating triangulation and a micrometer to establish distances, relative positions, and proportions. Russell showed the moon here and usually as gibbous because the raking light of that stage amplifies topography, hence heightens the sense of detail, and used a combination of various drawings and pastels under different viewing conditions to complete his finished images. Although this one has been damaged by moisture, causing a loss of detail, even so, the detail remains astonishing. Yet Russell's project was considered a failure because his maps contained neither grid nor legend. The images were not considered useful as maps. Rather, his images were not considered useful as maps, nor were they construed works of art. Above all, Russell's truly incredible detail and unprecedented scale doesn't get us any further to actually knowing the moon, at least insofar as representation goes. It again underscores the irony that more information supplied by ever more acute scientific or telescopic and humanistic or artistic means yields more understanding. In fact, rather the opposite can obtain, as suggested by another, in similar ways, ultimately colonial project, this one with more hope of succeeding, just getting going around the same time. In the last lecture, you recall we took a detour from looking only at representations of the moon to consider the first telescopic images of it from the early 16th century in relation to contemporary portrayals of another terra incognita, 16th century Virginia, and depictions of its Algonquian inhabitants by Thomas Harriot and John White. Just as we saw parallels between an interest in mutually familiarizing characterization of both the moon and North America at that time, a well-known image of South America from a few years after Russell's pastel can be similarly revealing. And appropriately for this talk's eco-critical orientation, the image here, Alexander von Humboldt's Plant Geography of 1805, is explicitly concerned with ecology, although that term didn't yet exist, or perhaps proto-ecology then, because Humboldt's concept and the image produced to describe it, like Russell's hyper-detailed image of the moon, ultimately subverted their purpose in similar ways. Humboldt's concept of the geography of plants linked physical and with botanical geography to account for the distribution of organic life as influenced by varying physical conditions. His theory regarding altitude, climate, and botanical disposition prompted his ideas about the mutual dependence and connection of things, as he said, in their relation to the whole. And eventually, by considering latitude as analogous to altitude and developing the notion of isothermal zones, encompassed the entire world. Humboldt produced this drawing, his Naturgemälde, literally painting of nature, but also connoting unity or wholeness, encapsulating in one heavily annotated image the essence of his discovery. The Naturgemälde is overlaid with botanical notations indicating the range of species according to altitude and flanked by tables with copious additional information. But the picture, like Russell's, in its profusion of closely observed information, belied its intent its overwhelming plethora of minutely detailed parts ultimately undermining ecology's fundamental trait of radical interconnectedness and unity. Something similar happens with the grandest painting of Humboldt's follower, Frederick Edwin Church. In perhaps the best known 19th century American landscape painting, critics said it was as if several pictures, each minutely detailed, had been stitched together to create one overwhelming image. The result, wrote one, was that his pictures occasionally break down or fly into scattered fragments, the forms being too subtle for firm cohesions, subordination, and unity. Seeking to be all-encompassing then, Church's sweeping composition and great detail had the counterintuitive effect of distancing his pictures from the very unity they sought to portray. His extreme particularization, reifying in paint the profusion of nature's details, ironically worked against comprehending them in their now overwhelming totality. Humboldt himself advocated suppression of all necessary detail, as he said, as the means through which his overarching unity of life might best be apprehended. Too much detail confused and thereby removed the viewer from understanding and access. Returning to Russell, this is his so-called Selena Graphia, the first detailed three-dimensional representation of the moon. And it, as you can see, is similarly elaborate and precise in its rendering of the moon's surface. And it includes calibrating devices to account for libration, which is the oscillation of the moon by which parts near to the edge of the disk that one sees appear sometimes visible and sometimes not, based upon fluctuations in its orbit. The Selena Graphia was produced for wide distribution, but only a few were sold, and only 11 are known today. The small globe, which you see sort of appended to the moon in each of these images, and the manipulation of which allowed for accommodation of parallax, now seems a metaphor for the degree to which Russell's outsized obsession with detail failed to enlarge earthly understanding of the Earth's satellite. As I say, Russell was in any case primarily a portraitist. Here is his portrayal of Joseph Banks, 1788, who was president of the Royal Society and promoted Russell's interest in the moon. Note in particular the visual rhyme between the gibbous portrait of Banks and of the moon, each rendered with the artist's characteristic detail, if not so obsessive as his larger moon portraits. Russell's role as portraitist and this picture's compositional affiliation of sitter's head and moon affords us a way in to unmasking, as it were, another fallacy of period representation. As we've seen with Humboldt and Church, a preponderance of detail doesn't necessarily lead to greater understanding or effect, much less, in the case of the moon, render it more conducive to earthly imaginings. The portrait of Banks engages a related belief that surface equates to substance. That is, that what's on the surface affords insight and understanding of what's beneath, or of what's essential, or of the thing itself, or generally of the subject. In portraiture, this idea was embedded in the late 18th and early 19th century, when Russell was at work, from the belief that history, human affairs, are ultimately a matter of biography. The concept that certain great men, and it was, of course, nearly always men, were the keys to and the best way of accessing and explaining the past, and through it, the present. As late as 1841, in his influential lecture, The Hero is Divinity, Thomas Carlisle would assert, universal history, the history of what man has accomplished in this world, is at bottom the history of the great men who have worked here. They were the leaders of men, these great ones, the modelers, patterns, and in a wide sense, creators of whatsoever the general mass of men contrive to do or attain. All things that we see standing accomplished in the world are properly the outer material result, the practical realization and embodiment of thoughts that dwelt in the great men sent into the world. The soul of the whole world's history, it may justly be considered, were the history of these. Such a climate had led to the promotion of not just biography as a means of understanding, but also of its visual corollary, portraiture. From the mid-18th century, in works such as Sir James Granger's Biographical History of England, an essential part of the project of history as biography was portraiture. Granger's text, indeed, was primarily structured to provide a system for classifying British portrait prints in various biographical categories, and was intended to lead to the extensive extra illustration, eventually known as Grangerizing, of this book. And you see an example of that on the right. So hence images became on par with words in constructing biography. From such a construction, it was little distance to the conviction that the physical features of these great men, and people generally, could be critically read and would thus reveal character. This was an ancient practice going back at least to Aristotle, who said, "It is possible to infer character from features. It is granted the body and the soul are changed together by the natural affections." This was the thesis as well of Johann Caspar Lavater's physiognomy of around 1775, and indeed of the physiognomical portrait of Lavater himself at Wright. According to Lavater, the character of a person could be elucidated through examining what he called their lines of countenance. The pseudoscience of physiognomy, looking carefully at facial surface to draw conclusions about characterological essence, illuminates contemporary efforts to divine the true nature of the moon. And these in turn constitute the ultimate anthropocentrization of it, the assumption, as in the works by Mellon and others we've seen, culminating in Russell, a close contemporary of Lavater, that, quoting Duncan in Macbeth, one might, quote, find the mind's construction in the face. But ultimately, of course, Shakespeare better understood the nature of character and of representation, and the full quote from Macbeth is, "There is no art to find the mind's construction in the face." The engraving of Lavater from the previous slide is by none other than William Blake. The two knew one another via Henry Fuseli, the Swiss artist. It's difficult to imagine two more different characters. Lavater, the paradigm of Enlightenment objectivity, however misguided, Blake of romantic subjectivity. As it happened, Blake engraved some of the images for a translation of Lavater's essays on physiognomy. If William Russell's hyper-realistic images had left the moon seeming as unfamiliar as ever, artists of the succeeding era, Blake's, gravitated to that very estrangement as a metaphor. Here, Blake's etching expresses the ultimate foreignness of the now fully rendered, and as a result, only more foreign-seeming moon, even as it literalizes the human desire to connect with the ineffable, unreachable entity through the lens of childhood desire. Its radically diminutive size, it's only 2 by 2.5 inches, only underscores the difficulty in obtaining the aim it describes. The engraving was part of a tiny book intended for children containing 17 images, each with a short caption depicting human life from birth to death. While they touch upon Christian themes, images in the Gates of Paradise are also cohered by their scenes of vibrant ecology. In it, human figures are repeatedly mixed and remixed with the earth. In one, coupled with the phrase, "I found him beneath a tree," a female figure yanks smiling children up from the ground as if uprooting carrots. This quieter but low-key image here on the screen expresses, I think, a corollary of that ecological orientation, the desire for closeness to the non-human but natural other, figured here by one of its prime symbols. And this at a time when estrangement from the natural world as an artifact of modernity and its attendant industrialization was very much at issue. Which leads us to phase 6, romantic revision, wherein the moon is engaged and represented less as an object to be known in, for, and of itself, than as a thing that played upon and in some sense expresses human emotions. It becomes framed by earthly experience and symbolizes melancholic longing for shifting and vulnerable conditions there, not in outer space. Among the most poignant expressions of the romantic desire for closeness to nature and of the increased estrangement from it is one of the great romantic poems, William Wordsworth's Ode, written a few years after Blake made his small engraving. Wordsworth's poem is similarly about innocence and connection to nature through the lens of childhood, the loss of which itself, he maintains, engenders a corresponding loss in closeness to the natural world, but also because of changes to that world itself. The beginning stanza lyrically sets the tone. There was a time when meadow, grove, and stream, the earth, and every common sight, to me did seem apparelled in celestial light, the glory and the freshness of a dream. It is not now as it hath been of yore, turn wherever so I may, by night or day, the things which I have seen, I now can see no more. Stanza 2 reinforces the sense of loss, concluding, the sunshine is a glorious birth, but yet I know, where'er I go, that there hath passed away a glory from the earth. Wordsworth's poem has usually been straightforwardly interpreted as the expression of the poet's difficulty, and that of adults generally, in maintaining or retrieving the closeness to nature attributed to youth in the Romantic era. Yet an important part of Wordsworth's larger project was a similarly romantic critique of industrialization, stemming from his belief in an idealized rural past and its affiliated social and moral relations, in contrast to the bleaker conditions of life in the modern era. Wordsworth matured as the Industrial Revolution in England itself reached maturity, and although he wrote intimations of immortality in bucolic Grasmere, a village in the midst of England's Lake District, he was little more than 60 miles north of the rapidly industrializing area today described as the Liverpool-Manchester megalopolis. This is where the great American arbiter of the nature-culture schism of the era, painter Thomas Cole, was born the year before Wordsworth began his ode. And we now understand Cole's sensibilities to have been importantly affected by his early exposure to unchecked industrialization. And considering Wordsworth's own ideas about modernity, it becomes difficult not to see intimations in it a broader criticism as well. A lamentation about not only the estrangement of individuals from nature with the advance of age, but also humans more generally with advancing development. We see a similar preoccupation with nature's evanescence through the figure of the moon and its light, especially as juxtaposed with scenes of settlement, of culture, throughout the work of numerous important and closely contemporary artists. Unlike 17th century Dutch landscapes made in much smaller numbers during the great period of mapping the moon we reviewed earlier, these evoke more than a source of light and are ultimately about contemplation and yearning. And they are set less in the countryside, as in Dutch works, and more in towns, cities, and harbors, sites of human imprint. Most prodigious among them was Johan Dahl, the Norwegian major figure in that country's art history. The common theme here is the disenchantment of the natural world that Max Weber later theorized as emerging at this time. And the work of Dahl and others seems either or both an expression of melancholic regret about it or an effort at re-enchantment, in either case approached through the device of the moon. In the Sociology of Religion and other works, Weber described the development of Western society, whereby scientific understanding, the science that produced that series of increasingly detailed but estranging moon maps we reviewed, is more highly valued than belief, and processes are oriented towards rational goals, as opposed to what he considered traditional society, in which, to quote, the world remains a great enchanted garden. Weber's critique of the process of disenchantment, which he saw as having both positive and negative aspects, was later taken up by the Frankfurt School, Jürgen Habermas in particular, in their examination of what they considered the self-destructive elements of Enlightenment rationalism. It is in images like these by Dahl and others, I think, that we see the moon deployed as both a figure of abiding, if abeyant, nature, and as an effort at resacralization of a culture contending with modernity's denaturalizing imprint. And I'll show you just a few examples by other artists at work elsewhere doing similar things. This is Eckersberg, Danish artist and founder of the so-called golden age of Dutch painting. Joseph Wright of Derby, British, who often produced serial imagery, as you can see in a couple of the images here. And most famously, Caspar David Friedrich, German, whose Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, you may remember from the first lecture when we talked about it in relation to iPhone distraction. Friedrich was part of an especially pervasive lunar culture in Romantic era Germany. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, for example, is from 1801. The moon's relation to the natural and the contemporary threat of remove from nature is suggested in a poem by Joseph von Eichendorff, who wrote that during a moonlit night, his soul opened its wings wide to fly home, as if by implication he'd been away from home, through hushed nature. Similarly, another German contemporary, the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, wrote, "Why has looking at the moon become, and again become as if it had not been so before, so beneficiary, so soothing, and so sublime? Because the moon remains purely an object for contemplation, not of the will." Again, that sense of the moon as a kind of newly identified vessel for communion with and return to a threatened nature. The moon is, per Schopenhauer, not a thing of the will, of intellect, of invention, of development and change. He continues, furthermore, the moon is sublime and moves us sublimely because it stays aloof from all our earthly activities. It sees all, yet takes no part in it. Takes no part, that is, in the earthly activities of the will that were reshaping Schopenhauer's and von Eichendorff's and Friedrich's world. Friedrich's best-known images of the moon, collectively known by the title here, although actually the Berlin picture in the middle shows a figure at left who is clearly dressed as a woman. But for our purposes here, dress is also significant in another way, in that each figure's attire identifies them explicitly as city dwellers, come here to the country to commune with nature in what is newly sensed as missing in town. That the focus of their gazes in each version over 10 years is squarely on the moon indicates how it has become a figure of the very nature, from a human perspective, that the hyper-detailed moon maps of the 17th century gradually drained from it. Friedrich's consistent use here and in his moonscapes generally of the Rückenfigur, a compositional device in which a person is seen from behind, from the fore or middle ground of the image, contemplating the view before them as a means by which the viewer can identify with the figure in the image, similarly suggests he intends a wide applicability to the images, a broad message in them. We're all, they seem to say, yearning for the moon. So let's end this section by looking at a few images in which the moon and nature and modernity and culture are brought directly in tension. The one becomes a foil for the other. Joseph Wright was the first English artist to explore the scientific interests as well as the environmental implications of the Industrial Revolution. Fittingly, given that interest and in this evening's specific context, he was an informal member of the so-called Lunar Society, a group interested in experimental science comprising intellectuals and leaders of the Industrial Revolution in the English Midlands. His portrayal of the new industrial-scale cotton mills of perhaps one of its members, which you see at left, seems telling. A curiously cramped and discomfiting image with a new inserted unsettlingly between the old and seeming barely to fit, and the encroaching natural, signified and illuminated by the moon, appearing to want to swallow it up and forget it ever happened. De Lauterberg's Coalbrookdale by Night suggests the impossibility of that, with the moon in abeyance, literally edged out by the themselves encroaching fires of the Bedlam furnaces along the River Severn in Shropshire. While the two images seem to diverge in both import and portent, both make clear the schism between nature and industry, and each adopts the moon to convey the message. Finally, I show you one of the many possible images of the moon over a moonlit landscape by John Constable to indicate that the predations of modernity and the moon's adoption as their foil were not limited to industry. Rather, they could engage the land, the earth itself, as in the enclosure movement, the push, especially in England, during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, to take land that had formerly been owned in common by all members of the village, or at least available to the public for grazing animals and growing food, and change it to privately owned land, usually with walls, fences, or hedges around it. Again, nature or access to it is in abeyance, and the moon is its symbol and witness. It seems then that by the 19th century, Romantic culture and artists, that they could not use science to make of the moon another Earth, as had been hoped earlier on, anthropocentrizing it in that way, proceeded instead in a different direction and rendered it a symbol of human relations to nature on Earth. Again, anthropocentric, of course, but with a newly terrestrial focus. Phase 7, positivistic. Romanticism's turn from focus on the moon proper to attend instead to his resonance with evolving earthly affairs turns out to have been something of a detour. Even so, the next phase of moon representation, the photographic one, was at least at first a bit of a disappointment. Early photography's limitations, given the combination of the moon's movement and the require at first for very long exposures of at least 10 minutes, meant that the new medium was not much of a factor in lunar imagery initially. Still, its mechanical nature promised an objectivity and an accuracy very much in keeping with the emergent discourse of scientific positivism. And its very technological basis betokened the shift, in this way like the preceding Romantic apprehensions of it, from focus on the moon itself to the human-oriented and produced technologies of both imaging and eventually actually getting to the moon. When photography was announced to the world in 1839 in Paris, astronomers quickly gravitated to Daguerre's invention, seeing in it a means to replace the need of painstaking and error-prone transcription of observations through a telescope into drawings, such as those we've seen, with a process that would instead save time and produce more accurate objective depictions. French astronomer François Arago, seeking to secure a government annuity for Daguerre to promote his work, noted, "We may hope to be able to make photographic maps of our satellite." In other words, it will be able to accomplish within a few minutes one of the most protracted, difficult, and delicate tasks in astronomy. John William Draper, a physician and professor of chemistry at New York University, was the first to produce a successful daguerreotype of the moon. On March 16, 1840, he wrote in his laboratory notebook, "This evening I exposed a prepared plate to the moonbeams, which had been conveyed by a double convex lens. In this plate, a halo-like vignette encircles the image of the moon, creating a crescent shape that evokes the lunar phases but had nothing to do with them, suggesting the difficulties of early photographic technologies in imaging the moon." Draper's image, in which the moon itself is merely an inch wide, offered nothing more than the naked eye might in itself see. There followed a rapid series of advances in both photographic technology and the linkage of telescopy to it, encapsulated here in a comparison of the quality and particularly the size of images taken by Draper and his son Henry a quarter century later. All this brought moon imagery approximately to where it had been before in terms of detail and verism, but now mechanically, and thus in the terms of scientific modernism, indisputably, and also significantly by the end of the 1850s, which saw the development of processes that used paper or glass negatives to make positive prints, with the possibility of reproducibility in multiples. And culminating ultimately in projects such as this, Charles Le Morvan's highly detailed images of just segments of the moon collaged together in very large images of many parts. But just as with a series of 17th century moon maps we reviewed earlier, these technological advances, following the establishment of photography's basic attributes, accurate, objective, and potentially infinite reproducibility by mechanical means, left the basis of the medium's engagement with the moon essentially the same. Although they did not yield anything fundamentally new about the moon or even its appearance, underlying all the successive campaigns in its photographic representation was an essential commitment to the era's faith in scientific positivism, a perspective advanced primarily by the French philosopher Auguste Comte, shown here appropriately in an engraving made from a daguerreotype, who between 1830 and 1842, just as photography was getting underway, published his course in positive philosophy. This reacted against Enlightenment metaphysics, the belief in and study of things that cannot be reached through objective observation of material reality, and posited instead that knowledge could only be obtained through empirical observation of the world. Seeing is believing, in a word. In such a climate, and abetted by the ongoing technological advances of the Industrial Revolution, photography itself a prime artifact among them, the medium's perceived capacity for unbiased observation made it the ideal positivist tool. And so the moon was photographed, even if all the effort had little effect on advancing understanding of it, beyond certifying the objective nature, by virtue of photography's mechanical means, of its observation, and by the terms of scientific positivism, in turn valorizing the technology that made such putatively impartial, accurate observation possible. The focus on enabling human technology as against the object of that technology, the thing enabled, itself a highly anthropocentric stance, is brought into relief if we refer back to an earlier account of a voyage to the moon and compare it to a mid-19th century one. In Francis Godwin's Man and the Moon, its protagonist is delivered to that place by a haphazard animal-powered contraption, seen in the frontispiece illustration here, that merits little attention in the text. Rather, the focus is on the place itself and its humanoid inhabitants, the Lunars, Christian people, happily enough, and their utopian paradise. Contrast this with Verne's From the Earth to the Moon, which tells the story of the Baltimore Gun Club and their attempts to build an enormous space gun to launch 3 people in a projectile to the moon. As both its cover and subtitle, A Direct Route in 97 hours, 20 minutes, suggest, the focus here is not on the nature of the moon, as with Godwin, but on getting there and the technology enabling it. Indeed, the story is remarkable for Verne's attempt to determine the requirements for the cannon and the rough accuracy of his calibrations, again indicating where his and the audience's interests fundamentally lay. So in the end, perhaps the romantic reset in orientation away from the moon itself and toward its more earthbound symbolizations, as we observed earlier, wasn't entirely dismissed by the succeeding positivistic age. In some sense, the focus remained on people and their concerns, even as these shifted from the moon's use as a figure of fear of advancing technology and the modernity that came with it, to one of their embrace. Decades later, Verne's novel served as the basis for Georges Méliès's film, A Trip to the Moon, the first science fiction movie, which, although its protagonist actually made it there and landed, is also primarily oriented to the journey and the human technology that allowed it. The film is ultimately parodic, though, with its satirically portrayed inept scientists, anthropocentric moon face, and impossible transgressions of the laws of physics. Even so, this moon face, already anthropocentric, humorously registers humans' apparent need to leave their imprint on it. Okay, last phase, mirror phase, which actually the previous image was an apt expression of, with its man in the moon theme. But here I'm referring to a later period in lunar imagery in which the tables are turned, so to speak, and in terms of terminology and concept, and borrowing from Jacques Lacan, for whom the mirror phase in human development, he's speaking of the development of individuals and children in particular, corresponds to Freud's stage of primary narcissism. That is the stage of human development when the subject is in love with the image of themselves and their own bodies, which precedes the love of others. And here we have it on cosmic scale. This is the first reasonably good image of Earth from the moon, taken from Lunar Orbiter 1 on August 23, 1966. It did not become well known in part because available technology limited the quality of the image to the grainy black and white one you see here, and partly, I think, because it was not taken by a human, but rather robotically. In what became known as the Apollo age, after the series of NASA space expeditions bearing the name of that classical sun god, countless images and representations of all kinds of the moon, from science to science fiction, from art to kitsch, and sometimes, as here, of Earth from the moon, emerged in keeping with the quickening pace of outer space exploration and the technology to abet it. But in this last phase of our journey together through images of lunar imagery, I want to focus not on the moon, but on the two best known images taken from it. Indeed, on what have been called the two best known, or at least widely distributed images anywhere. As the caption suggests, this picture of the moon was taken by a human, and although its improved quality and color alone explains its far wider distribution and appeal, at least as much of its import and renown has to do, unsurprisingly, given all we've learned about anthropocentrism and the moon, with the human affect and drama that attended its creation and reception. This Earthrise was snapped by astronaut Bill Anders on Christmas Eve, 1968. It shows our fragile, isolated planet emerging from darkness as the Apollo 8 space capsule circled the moon. Inspired by the view, Anders and his fellow astronauts together read, to the biggest audience in broadcast history, the initial verses of the biblical Genesis on the creation of heaven and earth, perhaps seeking a familiar narrative for their unprecedented experience. Interestingly, the astronauts did not read the subsequent verses in which God instructs man to rule over the world. Perhaps it seemed antithetical in that crystalline moment when the unity of life on Earth was made so vividly apparent. The following day, details of the mission dominated the news. At the bottom of the front page of the New York Times, an essay by poet Archibald MacLeish articulated a similar sentiment. Whereas previously humans, quote, saw themselves as creatures at the center of the universe, the sole particular concern of God, MacLeish wrote, now in the last few hours, the notion may have changed. No longer that preposterous figure at the center, man may at last become himself. And we can, quote, see ourselves as riders on the earth together, brothers on that bright loveliness in the eternal cold. Earthrise has been described as the most influential environmental image ever made. It came at a propitious moment as the first great environmental movement was gathering steam in the wake of books like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and a host of environmental disasters, from the DDT poisoning that was her focus to Cleveland's Cuyahoga River erupting in flames, to a host of oil spills and other toxic insults. And in keeping as well with the anti-establishment ethos more generally of the 1960s counterculture movement. Stanley Kubrick's epochal 2001, A Space Odyssey, released a few months before, in a way prepared the ground for Anders' photo. At the end of his brilliant sci-fi dystopian epic, and somewhat inscrutably in terms of the intended meaning, the so-called star child, a being enlightened by its exposure to other worlds, returns to Earth in a not dissimilar image. In the context of Kubrick's story and of Earthrise, I think it means that just as the star child had been helped along evolutionarily and in terms of heightened consciousness from existence beyond the Earth and then returned to it, so the astronauts' experience of another world, the moon, enlarged their own consciousness, and through their photo, ours as well, regarding Earth's unique, at least in our solar system, properties for life. But as the popularity and impact of Earthrise suggests, we could not help but see the expedition to the moon and the moon itself, but through our own human earthly lens and interests. As Jim Lovell, who accompanied Bill Anders of Apollo 8, famously noted after the mission, we went to the moon to discover the moon, and we discovered the Earth. The image itself underscores this. Here's the actual photograph Anders took, oriented as it appeared in orbit as the spacecraft rounded the moon and Earth emerged in partial sunlight. In this orientation, it makes much more sense in connection with that actual narrative. But it doesn't make as much sense for our anthropocentric sensibilities. The verticality of the original orientation imparts a vertiginous quality at odds with a soothing and affirming message the image as released supplies. So it was changed to suit our perspective. This is a still from Star Wars of a little less than a decade later, and I think it helps explain the decision to alter Earthrise. It shows the evil empire's Death Star about to blast the peaceful planet Yavin to smithereens. Note the formal similarities between George Lucas's cinematography and Anders' Earthrise. Perhaps the recognition on some level of consumers of each that we as viewers are posited as if in some indeterminate position in the vast void of space, potentially falling, though that of course would not actually have been an issue in outer space, makes the vertical orientation seem threatening. Rotating Earthwise 90 degrees allowed for the semblance of a base, a ground to use a terrestrial term, in the image, allowing viewers to rest conceptually there and focus on the glorious, now seemingly rising into light Earth. A similar logic seems to inform the manipulation as well of the second most widely known image of Earth from the moon, and the second such image taken by a person, now 4 years later, by the crew of Apollo 17. In addition to centering what has come to be known as the blue marble in the frame to make Earth properly the center of things, and cropping out much of the potentially threatening void, this image was also rotated, now 180 degrees, to accord with the human polar orientation, when, again, it made no sense to do so from space. And I hope you can see here that what we're looking at is Africa, the Red Sea, the Madagascar, the Arabian Peninsula, inverted on the left from our perspective, and right-sized on the right from our perspective. Like Earthrise, the blue marble was released during a surge in environmental activism and became a symbol of the movement as another evocation of Earth's fragility, vulnerability, and isolation amid the vast expanse of space. It seems also, in retrospect, a symbol of a kind of racism, or at least of the West's hegemony and sense of entitlement in representing the Earth writ large. Here's a much later image, also from NASA, and also dubbed by them blue marble. It's the one, or much like it, that we looked at in the first lecture, taken from my cell phone screensaver, which you see at the right, where it serves as a kind of yin to the moon's yang on the phone's second screen. Or perhaps better the other way around, since yang is considered the positive, active, masculine principle in nature per Chinese philosophy. In any case, it's interesting that this is the view that for Apple, and judging from an internet search of blue marble images for most others too, predominates, even against history, which seems an act reflection of the economic, military, cultural, and generally geopolitical dominance of the American hemisphere it features, as against the African one of the original. In 1970, the year the original blue marble was released, Gil Scott-Heron, the poet and singer best known for the spoken word jazz proto-rap album, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, released Whitey on the Moon as the space program was in full swing, expressing his disgust at its huge expenditure while people of color like himself languished, even as they helped pay for it. Like the relegation of the original blue marble's orientation around the global south to the side in favor of the white world to the north, Heron's biting lyrics express how even space is political and in its way unjust in ways that now resonate clearly with ideas about environmental justice. I'm no rapper for sure, but here are the first and last stanzas of Heron's Whitey on the Moon. A rat done bit my sister Nell with Whitey on the moon. Her face and arms began to swell, and Whitey's on the moon. I can't pay no doctor bill, but Whitey's on the moon. 10 years from now, I'll be paying still, while Whitey's on the moon. The man just upped my rent last night, 'cause Whitey's on the moon. No hot water, no toilets, no lights, but Whitey's on the moon. Was all that money I made last year for Whitey on the moon? How come there ain't no money here? Whitey's on the moon. You know, I just about had my fill of Whitey on the moon. I think I'll send these Dr. Bills airmail special to Whitey on the moon. Heron's different perspective on the vast project of better knowing the moon and the similarly politically shifting perspective of images of Earth from it invite consideration and perhaps something different. We've covered a lot of ground thinking about the moon, both last time and today, chronologically, culturally, conceptually. As a closing thought experiment to our time together, I'd like to wind down by asking, what if of the two iconic images we've just considered? What if Earthrise had been left in its original orientation, revealing thus not that humans are the center of things, and whenever they're not, can simply make it so, but rather that we are, like our planet itself, part of a vast universe of things both foreign and familiar, comfortable and uncomfortable, serving our needs and desires and not. What might be gained by seeing such an image and all that it stands for, in some sense removed from the entrenched and ingrained anthropocentrism so characteristic of our species? And if, by the terms of anthropocentrism, we are uniquely special, why can't or don't we set aside our self-centeredness to imagine other perspectives? What's to be gained? What's to be lost in doing so? As the world constructed by Darwin of relentless natural and social competition, read in tooth and claw, cedes to, or at least comes to share in the current understandings of ecology, a paradigm of multi-species sharing and reciprocity, how should we see or re-see the anthropocentrism that has, I think, arguably not served us or the Earth well in the age named after it, the Anthropocene? And with Blue Marble, what if the predominant version remained the one featuring the Global South? Might not that, at the very least, serve as a reminder that we are all here on this planet, all entitled, like all living things more broadly, to share in its resources? Maybe then we could revise astronaut Lovell's statement to something more like, we went to the moon to discover a different way of looking at the Earth. To return once more and finally to the moon itself, where, as we've seen, we seem impelled to leave our technological and human mark. Some of you may recall I began these lectures with an image of my bookshelf and all the moon books it holds. So I'd like to conclude with two books from that same shelf, particularly the images, the quite similar images of the moon on their covers. Probably unintentionally, but I think meaningfully nonetheless, each betrays the overarching theme of these talks, the pervasive ways, subtly and otherwise, that people have constructed the moon, and by implication, otherworldly, non-human things generally, in terms of themselves, and in particular in terms of our agency over them. Both images here suggest this by making the moon seem to inflect and alter even that most, by making the human seem to inflect and alter even that most non-human of places. On the left, the designer has marked, subtly, but it's there, the distant surface of the moon by photoshopping over it the blurred contrails of the jet that passes by in front, an appropriately carbon-spewing symbol of human technology. And on the right, the tightrope walker is positioned uncannily such that his outstretched arm and falling foot are directly over the so-called ejector rays made from the material blasted out of the craters from which they emanate, as if to suggest it was the tightrope walker that caused the disruption, another visual metaphor of the human impulse to imprint itself everywhere. In still another sense, it might accurately be said that we are on a tightrope back here on Earth, environmentally and thus existentially, and how we navigate it going forward in just the coming few years will have existential implications, not just for us, but for the vast, unknowably huge, and diverse multitude of life that lives around and even within us. Let's hope and try not to step off. Thank you.
Thank you, Karl, for that sweeping visual kind of tour almost of so many different kinds of cultures, cultural and aesthetic representations of the moon across so much time in from so many different sort of perspectives. And I'll hold my question for a moment. There's one here in the chat from Kat White. Thank you for a great lecture, she says. You've brought in fascinating examples of, in the first talk, the moon being mapped like a colonial conquest. And in this talk, parallels with physiognomy, which was also used to justify racism and colonialism, and also Western centrist images of Earth and the critique of NASA. Did you expect such themes as racism and colonialism to be so apparent in the record of representations of the moon when you began your study? And while you expressed in your first talk that you plan to focus mainly on the West, if you did run into depictions of the moon from non-colonizing or non-Western countries during your research, did you find they fit less into the trajectory you suggested? Gosh, I'm tongue-tied. That's such a great question, and it's so rich, and there's so many aspects to it. So go for it.
Yeah, that is a great question. Well, I can start by just saying, with respect to blue marble and sort of the implications of that, that was a pretty recent realization. You know, the one about Earthrise and the sort of shift in orientation is pretty well known, but the one about blue marble, less so, and I think very suggestive in light of the degree to which environmental justice has so kind of come to the fore happily, you know, in the past, say, decade. But your larger question is really interesting, and I quickly, as my crowded bookshelf from that first lecture might suggest, realized that I'd bitten off a really big chunk to try to contend with in this project, and that I needed to focus, and I chose to focus on the West. But there are very rich traditions, in basically every culture has contended in some meaningful way with the moon. And, the question about the degree to which the kind of hegemony and colonialism enters into it is, I would suspect, less so elsewhere, although I'm not an expert elsewhere. But when you think about those things being such a product of the West, a result of the West's kind of insinuation of itself into and onto everything else, it would make sense, or it would follow, that a lot of that aspect of thinking about representing the moon is particular to the world and the worldview that constructed itself as sort of separate and above others. But that will be maybe volume 2.
Yeah, a lot to think about. It makes me, I guess this relates to my question, which has to do with, and I haven't quite figured it out. I wish I could articulate it as well as Kat did hers, but this idea that some of the images that you showed were, we might consider, many of them were paintings, pastel, objects that, yes, we're both interested to different degrees in understanding something of the complexity and character of the moon. I think John Russell's pastel is probably one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. And clearly he was using various scientific means to get the kind of information that he needed to create that surface. But artists like Friedrich, for example, the moon doesn't serve that purpose in his kinds of images. Or the Danish artist whose name has left my head at this moment. And so I'm wondering about the differing kind of purposes of the many images that you showed. Some have more sort of aesthetic purposes. Some may have been used more for scientific advancement and understanding. I mean, there's a real sort of variety of uses. And certainly the most recent images that you showed were images that were taken, they're related very much to science and to astronomy. And I'm wondering, are there contemporary artists who are grappling with the moon and thinking about its visual representation? And I'm kind of wondering how they're engaging with it, whether it's more of a sort of aesthetic engagement or both scientific and aesthetic. I mean, I think I'm just sort of interested in what's happening now.
Yeah, interesting question too. In a way, I see 2 questions in there. One of them is a good point and true, in that I was sort of hopscotching a little bit, from, in particular, the jump from sort of scientific maps of the moon of the 17th century to sort of romantic landscape. And, those are your different projects, different briefs, different, and it's not to say that the one wasn't happening as the other was ongoing in each of those periods. But I think it's fair that during each of those periods, the sort of predominant, as far as I can glean, sort of attention to lunar things was shifted. And there were certainly things, I mean, some of the romantic painters that we looked at were actually working when people were doing, quote, scientific photographs of the moon in after 1839. So yes, I think there are different purposes to which these images are put. And I was, I think, trying to identify in each kind of epochal period the main thrust of kind of cultural interest in the moon and the differing ends to which it's served, as it relates arguably to the sort of human relationship to the non-human. But and then I think the most interesting person to contend, recently with the moon was Rauschenberg, which is a ways back. But he was actually commissioned by NASA, and he was sort of a space buff, regardless, and he lived in Florida. was commissioned by NASA to do a series of lithographs during one of the Apollo missions. And he produced a really interesting series. It's the Stoned Moon series. I think it's 1969. And there are a series of, I don't know, a couple dozen large lithographs in which what's most striking, I think, is the way that he almost tries to naturalize the space program. So he shows a lot of bodily images and images of birds and images of nature collaged together in his kind of, special way with images of technology and of rockets and scientific drawings, almost as if there was an interest in sort of bringing the two together in some way. So as perhaps, I don't know, to render them somehow more of a piece and less threatening. And then it's interesting too, because just a few years after that, he produces his famous Earth Day poster, which was 1970, so a year after, and that was done to promote the first Earth Day that year, which was itself, engendered in no small part because of Earthrise and because of that whole sentiment that astronaut Lovell expresses about going to the moon to see the Earth and to see, as McLeish said so poetically, the sort of special quality of it. So it's an interesting kind of juxtaposition that almost seems to work against each other, because on the one hand, he's sort of drawing, quote, progress and technology in the form of the space program into the natural in the Stone Moon series, and then critiquing it the next year in the Earth Day poster, which shows, as you know, a collage of scenes of environmental toxic degradation, sort of with a bald eagle in sepia tones superimposed, the symbol of America, superimposed over those images. So he seems in a way to be kind of interestingly conflicted.
Thank you. And we have one last question from Jin Cho, also a member of the seminar, who thanks you for your talk. And the question is, you've shared a variety of different captivating images of the moon, not only today, but in your lecture at the Nelson Atkins. Overall, how selective did you have to be in choosing the representations of the moon? Were there specific elements you were looking for among the body of moon images that you've come across and researched, which I think really speaks to this issue of how, sort of vast the body of material must be, and how wide-ranging the examples you showed were?
Yeah, a good question and a fair one, and yeah, again, one, I don't, maybe it's been written, but one could write a book about representation of the moon in Chinese painting. I mean, there's meaning there is just a plethora of images. And I guess, Jin, I was seeking, yes, to find a through line, but trying to be respectful and sort of judicious and fair-minded about letting the images sort of lead, so that, yes, I wanted there to be a kind of story, but I also didn't want to lead the story in a way that, seemed somehow forced or dishonest is a strong word, because that's, as we all know as art historians, that's really not the point. So I tried to sort of look as closely as I could at as wide a range of images as I could. And as I was saying in response to Marnie's good question, just to sort of identify where sort of the zeitgeist of whatever period I was looking at how it was oriented towards the moon and how that manifested visually. And in the in the 17th century, there were this real efflorescence of images because the telescope was invented at the beginning of that century. This real efflorescence of images of the moon in that kind of scientific mode. At the same time, as I mentioned, there are Dutch landscape painters who are doing sort of moonlit scenes, but they're far fewer than the other, and there was, I think, a lot less attention to them, and I think the role they served was certainly different. So I just tried to follow the lead of the story, so to speak, and there are many paragraphs sort of that might come beneath it that, I guess inevitably get left out. But I'm trying to be faithful to again, what I saw is the sort of preponderant use of the moon culturally across time.
Thank you, and thank you for for your talk, for your careful attention, and thank you all for coming this evening. If we were all in the same space, I'm sure everyone would be putting their hands together and clapping and thanking you. It's really been an amazing experience to work with you in this way this semester. And certainly it's been wonderful to hear your thoughts about the moon. So thank you, Karl. And if the seminar participants would stick around for a moment, we will change your status and you'll be able to come in and say goodbye to Karl.
Awesome. And to those,
thanks everybody.
To those others who are signing off, thanks for tuning in, and I will hope to see you in person at some point. And a special thanks once more to my hosts and to Marnie.